Peter was a man of simple means, someone who lived a modest life, but his heart was rich with love for Margaret. They had met at a small gathering in their community, and from the moment they spoke, Peter was captivated by her charm and warmth. Margaret had a radiant smile and a kind soul, which drew Peter in like a magnet. Despite his financial struggles, Peter never felt insecure in his love for her. He worked tirelessly at odd jobs, from helping in construction to driving deliveries, just to make sure he could give Margaret what she needed. Whether it was a small gift to cheer her up or helping her family in times of need, Peter always found a way to support her. His love was pure and selfless, built on a foundation of devotion. Margaret admired Peter's kindness but didn't realize the extent of his sacrifices yet. Life was hard, but Peter's love for Margaret kept him going. He often found himself working late into the night, taking on any job he could find to make ends meet. Whenever Margaret needed something, Peter was there, even if it meant giving up his own comforts. His days were long and exhausting, but he never complained. He knew that Margaret's family was facing financial troubles, and he couldn't stand to see her worried. Every penny he earned went towards helping her out in some way. Peter was driven by love, not by the desire for anything in return. Margaret appreciated Peter's efforts but often felt guilty that he was doing so much for her. She tried to dissuade him from working so hard, but Peter was determined. He couldn't bear the thought of her suffering, and so he continued, giving everything he had, physically and emotionally. One fateful evening, Margaret's life took a sudden, dark turn. She had unknowingly become entangled with a group of men who were involved in illegal activities. These men had gained her trust, posing as kind and trustworthy friends. But one night, the police raided her home, accusing her of being involved in the crimes. Margaret was horrified, clueless about how she had been dragged into such a mess. Panic-stricken, she turned to Peter, who came to her rescue without hesitation. Though Peter had no part in the criminal activities, he made the ultimate sacrifice. He took the blame for everything, claiming he was responsible for the crimes. Margaret begged him not to do it, but Peter was resolute. He couldn't bear to see her life destroyed over something she hadn't done. Peter believed that his love for Margaret was worth the sacrifice, even if it meant spending years behind bars. Peter's time in prison was long and painful, filled with loneliness and the cold reality of confinement. But throughout those years, he held on to the hope that one day, he and Margaret would be reunited. He dreamt of the life they would build together, of the family they would have, and the future they could share. Letters from Margaret came sporadically, giving him brief moments of joy and hope. Her visits, once frequent, became fewer as time went on, but Peter didn't let it shake his belief that his sacrifice would mean something in the end. He counted the days until he would be released, imagining the moment when he would see her again. Prison changed him, making him more reflective, but it never diminished his love for her. Peter held on to the belief that love would prevail, that everything he endured would be worth it once he was free. After years of waiting, Peter was finally released from prison. His heart raced with excitement as he imagined seeing Margaret again. He had dreamt of this day for so long, picturing their reunion in his mind. But when Peter arrived at her doorstep, what awaited him was not the warm embrace he had hoped for. Margaret had moved on with her life. She was now engaged to Daniel, a wealthy businessman who had provided for her in Peter's absence. The news was a devastating blow to Peter, who had given up so much for her. The love of his life was now with someone else, and it shattered him. Peter felt betrayed, lost, and confused. He couldn't understand how the woman he had sacrificed everything for had moved on so easily. But even in his pain, Peter didn't show anger. He was too heartbroken to be anything but sad. Margaret, though happy with Daniel, couldn't shake the guilt that weighed heavily on her heart. She knew what Peter had done for her, how he had taken the blame and gone to prison out of love. Even though her life with Daniel seemed perfect on the surface, there was always a part of her that felt indebted to Peter. Every time she thought of him, memories of his sacrifice flooded her mind. She tried to justify her decision to be with Daniel, telling herself that Peter had been gone for years and that she had to move on. Daniel had been good to her and her family, stepping in when they were struggling financially. But no matter how much Margaret tried to convince herself, the thought of Peter and his love never fully left her. Deep down, she was torn between her past with Peter and her present with Daniel. When Peter finally gathered the courage to talk to Margaret, he wasn't sure what to expect. He hoped that she would explain why things had changed, why she had chosen Daniel over him. Margaret, on the other hand, struggled to find the right words. She knew that Peter deserved an explanation, but she didn't know how to give it. Daniel, sensing the tension, decided to intervene. He didn't want Peter to disrupt his upcoming marriage to Margaret. One evening, Daniel approached Peter with an offer. He offered Peter a substantial sum of money in exchange for his silence and departure from their lives. "I'm willing to give you whatever you want," Daniel said, "just leave Margaret and me alone." Peter, though hurt, refused the offer without hesitation. He wasn't interested in money. His love for Margaret couldn't be bought, and he made it clear that he only wanted her to be happy, no matter what. Margaret, feeling the weight of her decisions, visited Peter a few days later. She came to him with a heavy heart, pleading for him to accept Daniel's offer. She tried to convince Peter that it was time for both of them to move on. "Please, Peter," she said, her voice trembling, "you deserve better. Daniel has done so much for my family, and I'm about to get married. Let's put the past behind us." Peter, though deeply hurt, realized that Margaret had already made her choice. He looked at her with sadness in his eyes but spoke with love in his heart. "If you're happy with him, I won't stand in your way," Peter said softly. "But I don't want his money. I never wanted anything but your happiness." With those words, Peter set her free, even though it felt like his heart was being torn apart. He walked away, knowing that his love was true, but accepting that it might not be enough. The day of Margaret's wedding arrived, and the air was filled with excitement and anticipation. Margaret sat in her bridal suite, dressed in her wedding gown, surrounded by friends and family. Yet, as she stared at herself in the mirror, a sense of unease washed over her. Despite the beauty of the day, something didn't feel right. Her thoughts drifted to Peter, to the man who had sacrificed so much for her. She thought about how he had loved her so selflessly, even when it meant going to prison for a crime he didn't commit. Her best friend, Mira, noticed the change in Margaret's demeanor and sat beside her. "Are you sure about this?" Mira asked gently. "It's not too late to change your mind. If you don't want to marry Daniel, you don't have to. You can still choose Peter." Mira's words struck a chord in Margaret's heart, making her question everything. Margaret's mind raced as she weighed her options. Could she really go through with the wedding? She thought about Daniel, about how kind and supportive he had been to her and her family. But every time she tried to picture her future with him, Peter's face appeared in her mind. Peter, who had given up everything for her, who had loved her through it all. Margaret felt a knot in her stomach as she realized the truth: she had never stopped loving Peter. No matter how much she tried to move on, her heart had always belonged to him. In that moment, Margaret made a decision that would change the course of her life. She stood up, took a deep breath, and removed her wedding gown. Without saying a word to anyone, she grabbed her keys and rushed out of the venue, leaving behind the wedding and the life she thought she was supposed to have. Margaret drove as fast as she could, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew where she had to go. Peter's apartment was small and unassuming, but it was where she knew she would find the man she truly loved. When she arrived, she burst through the door, tears streaming down her face. Peter was sitting quietly by himself, lost in thought, still trying to come to terms with everything that had happened. When he saw Margaret standing there, his heart skipped a beat. She looked at him with desperation in her eyes and said, "Peter, I can't marry him. I realize that I don't want a life without you. You've always been there for me, and I was blind to it. Please forgive me. I want to be with you, not Daniel." Peter, though still hurt, saw the sincerity in her words and felt a glimmer of hope. Peter stood up slowly, taking a moment to process everything. He had waited so long for this moment, but he never imagined it would come like this. "Are you sure?" he asked gently, his voice filled with both hope and uncertainty. "This isn't an easy decision, Margaret. If you choose me, it won't be easy. But I promise you, I'll love you with everything I have, just like I always have." Margaret nodded, tears still falling from her eyes. "I'm sure, Peter. I don't care about the challenges. I just want to be with you." Peter smiled, his heart swelling with love and relief. He walked over to her, wiping away her tears, and whispered, "I've loved you since the day we met, and I'll love you for the rest of my life." They embraced, knowing that their love had been tested but had ultimately prevailed. In the days that followed, Margaret broke off her engagement with Daniel, who, though hurt, understood her decision. He had seen the way Margaret looked at Peter and knew that he couldn't compete with the history and love they shared. Margaret and Peter began building their life together, this time with no secrets or sacrifices. They faced challenges, just as Peter had predicted, but they faced them together, hand in hand. Their love had been through so much, but it had survived, stronger than ever. Peter continued to work hard, but this time, it was for the future they were building together. Margaret, now fully aware of the depth of Peter's love, cherished every moment they spent together. Their story was one of sacrifice, redemption, and the power of true love. And though it had taken them years to find their way back to each other, in the end, they realized that love had been worth every sacrifice.